Hello and welcome to the 37th edition of Naturally Scott. I'm your host, Scott Harris, and we've got Ken Kaufman lined up for us today. If you're a birder, you already know Ken. You know him through his field guide, you know him through his books, you know him through Kingbird Highway, you know him through his speaking engagements. And if you're not a birder, you're going to love meeting this guy. 60 plus years of birding. He's an artist, he's a writer, he's a speaker, he's brilliant, he knows birds, and he's going to talk to us about all of those different things. I think you're going to have an absolute blast. Ken and I have become friends, for which I am very grateful. I've enjoyed my conversations with Ken, and I'll give you a little hint. Ken's already agreed to come back and do another one of these. So enjoy this one. Have a great time. Enjoy Naturally Scott, and stay curious. Hello and welcome to this edition of Naturally Scott. I'm your host, Scott Harris. I am happy that you are here. And as is becoming rather redundant, I'm excited about today's podcast and looking forward to talking to you about our guest. Our guest today is Ken Kaufman. If you are a birder, you are familiar with Ken and many of his exploits. You've read his columns or read his books, or you have his field guides, or you've heard him speak, or you've seen him model, or any of the things that Ken happens to do. Ken is a guest in my book, Why We Love Birding, which I am very appreciative of. And we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff, but I'm going to share a quick story first, and then we're going to highlight something of Ken's out of order. The rest of it will mostly be in life order. But Ken, welcome to the show, man. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thanks, Scott. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
I enjoy it too. I've been looking forward to this one, but I got to share the story, and I don't think I've shared it with you. When we first moved here to South Carolina, which was almost 6 years ago now, I wasn't a birder. And we've got this really nice screen porch out here that overlooks the lake. And I was sitting out there with my son, and we were watching, and some birds were flying by. And I was not a birder. I was a naturalist. I mean, I once took a 6-month camping trip, but I just wasn't particularly a birder. So I said, I got to learn what these birds are. Casual throwaway comment, man. No, not meant to be anything. And I didn't even know if my son heard it. And then a couple of days later, a box shows up from Amazon, and I open it up, and there's 2 books in there. And one of them is Sibley's Guide to the birds of Eastern North America. And the second one is a book, you may even be familiar with it, called Kingbird Highway. So my son had done a little research, and he thought these were the 2 books that I should start my birding career with. And I got to tell you, I don't know if there could have been 2 better books. So thank you for that. I enjoyed your book. We will talk about it. We'll take you back into the past. I'm sure you've never had an opportunity to discuss Kingbird Highway before, so we'll see if we can create that for you. But I'll tell you what I want to talk about first. I don't want to talk about it. I want you to talk about it. I want to listen. Tell me about the paintings. You've gotten heavily into painting in the last few years. You've been honored with some appearances. Tell us about that.
Okay. Yeah, I started, I didn't really get interested in birds until I was about 6. And before that, I just was, liked looking at pictures of big animals and stuff. But living in the suburbs in Indiana, we didn't have any dinosaurs or bears, but I started looking at the birds, and they turned out to be quite fascinating. So within a year or 2, I was trying to draw pictures of them and trying to sketch them as they moved around, and then, trying to copy pictures from books. As a teenager, I did a lot of drawing and painting, and I've sort of gone into it and then pulled away from it multiple times. Did pen and ink illustrations for my first book, did paintings for magazine columns for a number of years, columns on how to identify birds. Then I sort of got away from it while I was working on the field guide series, because they were illustrated with digitally edited photos, which is sort of an art form in itself. And then about 12 years ago, I just really wanted to do something more creative, so I got back into painting in a big way. And I just love it. I'd done illustrations trying to show every feather in place for, this is how you identify these 2 sparrows. But I'm really enjoying doing something where the focus is on light and shadow and form and composition, and it doesn't matter if the field marks show. And just the exploring what you can do when you just let the light and the form dictate things. If you have a flamingo, for example, I had a painting of flamingos that made it into the latest exhibition of birds in art. and two American flamingos standing in sort of with a dark background. If you have side light on them, the side toward the light, even though it's pink, it's going to look almost white. Light and shadow is going to look a dark reddish brown. And if you don't get that right, it doesn't look realistic. So I just love seeing what colors do with light and shadow.
Now, do you find that you look at birds differently through an artist's eyes rather than a writer or a birder or even a photographer?
Well, I don't really know because I've been looking at them from an artistic uh, standpoint, or at least an illustrative standpoint, since I was a kid, and done a lot of like sketching birds in the field because it's such a good way to see details. You know, if you're trying to draw something and get it right and it's not looking right, you keep looking at the bird and realize, okay, actually that's a much longer tailed bird. You know, there's this field sparrow. It has a much longer tail than the other sparrows that it's similar to. And so getting your sketch right, you see details. And I can't really get away from that. Even if I'm doing a painting and just focusing on light and shadow, if the shape of the beak is wrong, I have to go back and fix it.
Are all of the paintings of birds?
Yeah, I well, actually, we did in the field guide to mammals that I did with Nora Bowers and Rick Bowers. It's illustrated with digitally edited photos, but we couldn't get any photos of like the entire whale underwater. You know, there are technical difficulties there. So I painted the marine mammals. I painted all the dolphins and whales and things as they would appear underwater if you could see them. But otherwise, yeah, it's all been birds and, you know, sometimes the plants and things that are around the birds.
Is it a different challenge to paint marine mammals than it is birds?
It must have been because I wasn't very good at it. But the results were serviceable. They served to show sort of what the critter looked like.
All right, fair enough. Having seen whales underwater, I've scuba dove with whales off the coast of California. I think that capturing whales underwater and capturing redwood trees and sequoia trees is remarkably difficult for artists or photographers. It's just, it's just a massive challenge, literally and figuratively. So
Yeah.
tell us
No, I'm
about
just agreeing
birds in
with you.
art. Well, I
Birds and
appreciate that, doesn't it? It doesn't happen often. So we should pause for a moment and celebrate that. Tell me about birds in art.
Okay, yeah, it's there's this art museum in Wausau, Wisconsin, the Lee Yockey Woodson Art Museum that opened in 1976. The Woodson family had donated land and building and lots of money to build this art museum for the community, and it's you know, Wausau is not a big city, and it's a remarkable art museum to have in a town of that size. But when it opened in 1976, they wanted to have something splashy to open it up. And there's a Wisconsin artist named Owen Gromy who he was nationally known. He happened to be friends with the Woodson family, and they asked him for suggestions. So he said, why don't you do an exhibition of bird art?" So he brought together a bunch of his paintings, and he got paintings from some of his friends who his friends happened to include all the best wildlife artists in North America. So they had this exhibition the first year, and it was a huge success, and thousands of people came to it. So they did something like that the next year, and again, it was a huge success. So they just continued with that, and it's been this year is the 50th year of Birds in Art, and people submit. You know, you send in. We used to be mailing slides, and now you just send something digitally, a picture of the artwork, the painting or sculpture, and there's a jury. It's a different jury every year of art experts to make the selections. And this year, they had, I forget, it was like 700, 800 some artists submitting over 1,100 works, and they chose 100 of those. So it was a big deal to get accepted. And the art exhibition, it opened in early September in Wausau. And of course, my wife and I went to the opening, and it was great. There were 80 of the artists were there, and the whole community comes out, and they're so supportive. It's an amazing event. And this is only the fourth time I'd made it in to Birds in Art in the last 11 years, and it was just, you know, one of those one of those experiences you remember all your life.
I'm not sure if you should use the word only 4 times. I think 4 times stands alone as a pretty positive thing. Do you get chills when you walk in the building and see your work?
I do, yeah. Actually, I get chills when I walk in and see all the work because it's so amazing, and there's such a variety of approaches and styles. And this year I got to talk to artists from all over the U.S. and from Britain and Belgium and Australia and India, and just artists from all over who had submitted work and had it accepted, and we were all just a wonderful experience. And the whole community comes out. Members of the Woodson family are still coming there, and Andrew Wyeth's granddaughter was there. Just it was this an amazing weekend.
Wow. Do you think that meeting some of these people and seeing some of their works will influence future projects of yours?
There's the influence, and just being there is such a wonderful experience that I think I talked to a bunch of the artists about this. We all feel like, it's such a thrill to actually get accepted and to be there that we go back and go back to our studios and start working on next year's. Just trying to do our best in hopes of being accepted again.
Well, that's fantastic. So what are you working on now? Or what's the next project?
You mean in terms of art or other
Yes,
things?
yes. We'll get to other things, but yes, in terms of art.
Oh, I've got because I work in oil, I've always got multiple paintings in the works at once. I'm also doing some pen and ink drawings. A couple of friends are writing a book about Theodore Roosevelt and his interest in birds. And so I'm doing pen and ink illustrations of some of the birds just to illustrate their book. And that's just a fun, like, side project. But I've
Oh,
got,
that's great. I've really been enjoying getting in a bit to Teddy Roosevelt. I'm looking up at, shoot, I gotta find what the name of it is. Well, I'll find it here in a second, but one of the guests on the show wrote a book about Teddy Roosevelt, and Scott Edwards, who is an ornithologist and runs a natural history museum at Harvard. He and I had a long discussion about Teddy Roosevelt as well. Tell it shoot. Well, now I'm embarrassed. I can't see it. I know it's sitting right in front of me, but leave it as it is. David Gessner wrote the book called
oh,
Leave It
okay,
As It
right.
Is.
Yeah,
You read
Gessner,
that?
he's quite an author. I haven't read that one, but I've read some of his other books.
Yeah,
Um,
David's a guest, I wanna say next week.
cool.
Anyway, David's a guest relatively soon, and that's one of the books we'll talk about.
Yeah, he wrote.
It's just a terrific book, and go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I was just gonna say he wrote All the Wild That Remains, which is an amazing book. I just read that recently. Yeah, sorry, I shouldn't be interrupting you, but
No, you absolutely should. You're the guest. The audience, they hear me all the time. They don't give a crap what I have to say. So, all right. So let's back it up a little bit. You had mentioned that you started birding when you were 6. In a previous conversation, I asked you if you had a spark bird, and you said no, you couldn't remember a specific bird. They were just kind of always there. And then in some notes I've read and some stuff you shared with me, when you were a young man, you were very much into chasing and listing as a teenager, and that led to hitchhiking and dropping out of school and great friends in Arizona and trips to Mexico and a big year and a hugely successful book. So walk us through some of that.
um, I don't know if walking is the appropriate way to do it. I started birding in Indiana. My family moved to Kansas when I was about 9, and had there's actually Kansas is a good birding state. There are a lot of birds that migrate through there, and there was a very supportive group of adults in the Wichita Audubon Society. And my best friend in school, Jeff Cox, got into birding, and we did a lot of birding together. But I would read about all these things that are not in Kansas, and so eventually, when I was 16, at that point, I was doing well in school. Had straight A's. I'd been the student council president, but I felt like in most subjects, I was sort of on a par with other 16-year-olds, but on birds, I felt like, I was so modest. On birds, I felt like I knew a lot. And I'd learned that on my own and not in classrooms. So I thought, maybe I can educate myself about some of these. So I just went out and started traveling around the country. First, my parents said, don't do any hitchhiking. So I left on a Greyhound bus. But then soon, Greyhound buses don't go to all the birding hotspots. So soon I
Really?
was just hitchhiking. Yeah, really amazing.
That's
Hitchhiking
not
all
how
over.
they established their roots?
Yeah, I mean, it should be, yeah, but they go to all the dog tracks. But so, eventually I just, hitching coast to coast and up the Alaska Highway to Alaska and back and just some ways down into Mexico and just really working on my life list. Information was harder to find then. You didn't have stakeouts for every single bird, but as the American Birding Association was formed about the time I was 16, so I had just joined, and their first little magazines had stuff like, okay, well, here's where to find the five-striped sparrow in Arizona, which wasn't even in the Western Field Guide, and so it's like, so I'm going around looking for all these things, and decided like the favorite book of my early teen years had been Wild America by Roger Peterson
Mhm.
and James Fisher, which is an
I
account of its.
actually I just started that 2 days ago at your recommendation. I'd ordered it when we spoke last, and it just made it to the top of the nightstand.
Okay, great. Great. Well,
Yeah.
it's sort of another time. It might not be something that can get published today, but they made this big trip around North America in 1953 and wrote about it. And I was just so fascinated by that. One little footnote in the book mentioned that Roger Peterson set a new record for a North American year list that year. And I thought, wow. So, at the age of, I guess by the time I was 18, I thought, I'm really good at this hitchhiking stuff. And, maybe just by getting around that way, I could break the current record. And so I started to do it and then discovered that the record had been broken the year before by a teenager named Ted Parker. So I gave up for a while, went out to Arizona and hung out with Ted Parker and a group of friends there. We called ourselves the Tucson Five, but I was still ambitious to go see new birds. So the year that I turned 19, I went out and actually did this hitchhiking thing.
And what year was that?
I'm sorry? Well, that was
What year was that?
1973.
1973.
1973, ages ago, back in the Pleistocene. But so, yeah, hitchhiked. I think I hit Florida like 6 times that year and hitchhiked to Alaska and back and just back and forth, tracking birds down. And, in the end, wound up in second place for the year because there was another guy named Floyd Murdoch he wasn't hitchhiking, but he was doing a big year too. But it was such a neat experience that I decided to, I should write this down. Um, so I wrote like the two following years, 74 and 75, I sat down and wrote this uh, manuscript, which was awful. The first draft was just totally awful. And fortunately, I had no chance of getting it published. So I just tossed this stack of paper, typewritten pages into a box and left it for 15 years. And in the early 90s, I dug it out and started working on it. And it eventually was published as Kingbird Highway.
So it sat dormant for 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
It was
Yeah,
like a cicada of books.
that's right. Tunneling around underground, right. But it was, the thing was the first draft was just really, really awful. And it was 4 times the length of what was eventually published, but it had all these details that I wouldn't have remembered otherwise. So when I went back to revise it, I was like, oh yeah, I remember. So I had the raw material. And I think letting it, if it had been published in the late 70s, it might have gotten some notice. It wouldn't have been a good book. Um, it wasn't published until 97, but it's still in print now, 28 years later, and people are still reading it. And I'm just amazed.
Well, I read it and I enjoyed it, and I love the story. I think it was great. I think, you're a little tiny bit flippant about it, but the idea of hitchhiking around the country when you're 16 or 17, it takes a pretty big pair. That's a pretty cool thing to do, as a matter of fact. And I applaud you for having done that. I think that's remarkable.
Well, I
So
certainly wouldn't recommend hitchhiking to anyone today, but back then everybody was doing it. Any freeway on ramp, there would be a dozen guys at a time, and occasionally a girl out there just waiting to catch a ride to someplace, and it was just an accepted way to travel.
yeah, hitchhiking now is rare. Picking up hitchhikers is rare.
Yeah.
You know, I recently tried in the last year, just for fun, I tried thumbing in North Carolina and in California. And in both cases, I was out for about 2 hours and did not get a ride.
Ouch.
I just,
Well, if I see you out there, I'll pick you up. Okay.
I appreciate that. My next effort will be in Ohio, about a block from your house, and I'll just stand on the corner until you or Kimberly comes driving by, and then see if I can't get. But yeah, I couldn't get a ride in either place. Perhaps it's me. So hitchhiking has changed in the half century since you did that. How about big years? How have big
Oh
years
yeah,
changed?
yeah, yeah. Big years are utterly different. Lots of people doing them now, and there was a lot of inspiration I think that came from the book by Mark Masick called The Big Year, and then which was a good book, and then there was a movie that was very very loosely very loosely based on the book. You had Greg Miller on as a guest.
I had Greg and Debbie Shearwater's coming up. She
Yeah,
was she was in the movie as well. Angelica
that's right.
Houston played her. But yeah,
Yeah,
Greg and Debbie are both in the book. Greg was my very first podcast guest, and Debbie is scheduled actually for two as by herself. And then there's one that she's doing with it's a panel discussion with her and Cy Montgomery and Lynn Scarlett, all women, all have been birding for 50 years, and they're going to talk about how birding has changed in a half century for women. And then I've got another panel discussion set up with Scott Edwards, Drew Lanham, and Chris Cooper to talk about how birding has changed for black birders in the last half century. So yeah, anyway, I'm sorry.
that's
So
great.
Mark wrote the book, The Big Year. I got off track. This is how our last conversation lasted so
That's
long.
right. That's right. Yeah, the zigzags. But I'm looking forward to those two podcasts that you mentioned with the two
Oh, I
panelists.
am too.
Yeah.
I
Um,
am too. I think it's very exciting.
yeah, but Greg Miller is here in Ohio, and he's a great guy. I mean, his enthusiasm for birding is just so infectious that he'll come to bird festivals. Or like he'll come to the biggest week in American birding, and everybody wants to meet him. He's just always got smiles for everybody, and he's excited about every bird he sees, and just a lovable guy.
He truly
So
is. He's come and stayed at the house. We got to know each other in the same way you and I did. Started with emails and then moved up to electronic, and then Greg has come and stayed at the house, and he really is. He's just enthusiastic and dives headfirst into everything he does.
Mhm.
It's I love that about him. So that's a cool deal. Hey, you can't tell the whole story, but give us the executive summary going back to your friends in Arizona, the Tucson Five, and an eared trogon. Wasn't that your Mexico story?
yeah, the bird, it's called eared quetzal now, but just in 1973, while I was supposedly running around doing a big year north of the border, we took a few days to go down into western Mexico. Roseanne Rowlett had given us directions to a spot in the mountains of Durango where they had seen what was called the eared trogon at that time. And so we thought, hey, we got a 4-day weekend. We can drive 1,000 miles down into Mexico and go look for this. And so we did. It was 5 of us crammed into a small car, and drove down there, discovered that the area where Roseanne had seen the birds was now crisscrossed with all these logging roads, and none of the directions made sense, and we couldn't find the spot at all. And we were being crowded off the road by logging trucks as it was getting dark. So we finally found just a safe spot to pull off and camp. And we wake up in the morning and, just as it's getting light, and realize that we're right next to this sort of narrow canyon, and the canyon still has forest in it. The level ground has mostly been cleared, but in this canyon, there's still big trees, and we're sort of looking around, start hearing this weird call that turned out to be eared trogon. And we go into the canyon to look for it, and Ted Parker, who was always several steps ahead of everyone. Ted Parker realizes when the bird flies past us that it had come out of a hole in this pine trunk, and that was the nest. And there was a baby eared trogon looking out of the nest at us, and that was the first nest of that species ever known to science. So, just Mexico. That was such a frontier for us, kids with no money at that point, because you could get there. I went all over Mexico for years in my early 20s. I figured out at some point I'd spent more than 28 months in the field in Mexico, just, all over it, every state of Mexico. And I still love going back there on the rare occasions when I can.
Well, it's not as much free time at our age as we had in our teens and our 20s, I guess, unfortunately. Although, we weren't as worried about the risks back then either as we were taking our trips,
Yeah, I
which is,
wasn't smart enough to worry about risks.
well, that we had in common. So as we shift ahead, as we shift ahead a little bit in your life, you got into your 20s and 30s and you started to focus a bit on challenging bird IDs, not just finding as many as you can, but some of the challenging ones, and actually led to a Peterson Field Guide, right?
That's right. Yeah, my first book, the first one I'd claim, I contributed to some
Whoa,
before
whoa, whoa,
that.
whoa! I'm not letting that slide by. What do you mean the first one you claimed? Was there one before that you weren't thrilled with?
Oh, well, I contributed to some. There was something called the
Okay,
Audubon Society Book of Waterbirds that I wrote half the chapters for that, and the Audubon Society Master Guide to Birding, which sort of was a big deal briefly in the mid 80s and then disappeared. I wrote some sections for that. But
okay.
the Peterson Field Guide to Advanced Birding, even though it said Peterson on the cover, it had my name on it as the author and illustrator. So that's the first one I would claim. And it was about just a series of chapters on birds that were really hard to identify, like the dowitchers and cassins and bottery sparrows and Empidanax flycatchers and things like that. It was just there was all this stuff going on in the 70s before the National Geographic Field Guide had been published in 1983. In the 70s and 80s, we had pretty simple books like the Golden Guide and the Peterson Guides, and they didn't go into detail on any of these tough ideas. And so there were a bunch of, especially young birders, who would run around and try and figure these things out, look at museum specimens and read these old books that were full of, detailed feather by feather descriptions and try and figure out what the differences were. Some people were really pursuing specific things. Claudia Wilds, who lived in Washington, D.C., she went into great detail on things like the dowitchers and telling forsters and common terns apart and figuring out some of the gulls. So Claudia was one of the early, super experts on the fine details. Guy McCaskey in California and John Dunn, Kimball Garrett, they were working on things, figuring out these subtle distinctions. And so I had the idea, I'd written some magazine articles, but I thought, why not have a book with just chapters on some of these tough birds? And amazingly enough, I know when you're getting started as a writer, you're supposed to get all these rejection slips. But I wrote up this really careful proposal and sent it to the Houghton Mifflin Company, who published the Peterson Guides. And they mulled it over for a couple of months, but then they gave me a contract for it. So I took, several years to finish writing it and doing the illustrations. I did pen and ink um, drawings for it, but then it was published in 1990,
How was it
and
received?
it got a really good reception. I was really pleased. It sort of had the launch of it at the it came out in late April of 1990, but in June of 1990 there was a convention of the American Birding Association in Fort Collins, Colorado. And back then, before all the bird festivals really got going, the ABA convention was a really big deal. So there were hundreds of people there, and so the book was my advanced birding was sort of launched there. So there was an autograph session, and the line of people was out the door. And just, I think I autographed, two or 300 copies, maybe 300 or 400 copies at this convention. And unfortunately, the Harry Foster, the editor at Houghton Mifflin, who had been in charge of the project, he was there. and he was stunned when he saw the reception it was getting. So that made it easier for me to get more book contracts in the future.
Well, that's fantastic. Now, we'll talk some more about the books, and you've written a number of books, field guides and more traditional prose, if you would. But you've also written columns. You've been a columnist with American Birds and Birders World and others. So, do you enjoy the columns? Is that a fun thing for you? And how is that different than books?
I don't enjoy it, but it's I'm enough of a procrastinator that if that without a
Let me
without
apologize to the magazines that are currently running Ken's columns.
without a deadline, it's just too easy to let it slide. But yeah, I was writing an ID column called the Practice Die for American Birds, and then started doing a field identification column for Birders World, which later changed its name to Birdwatching and then went out of print. And then I was doing a column called After the Spark for Birdwatchers Digest for about 20 years. And in every case, I got to work with just really wonderful editors. Susan Drennan at American Birds and Eldon Gray at Birders World. And then the Thompson family, Bill Thompson and others at Birdwatchers Digest. And in every case, they gave me free rein to pretty much talk about what I wanted to in that space. And so it's like, okay, it's been 2 months. I got another deadline coming up, or another deadline that just went past, and I have to write 2,000 words about something having to do with bird watching. What's it going to be? So I don't know. It gave me a chance to write about some experiences that I wouldn't have seen print otherwise.
And it's for those who haven't had an opportunity to write a column, it can be challenging. I had a weekly syndicated political column for a number of years. And, if I was doing it today, there would be no shortage of things to write about. But in less turbulent times, you're kind of trying to dig stuff up. And then at the same time, in a completely different part of my life, I was writing a humor column for a monthly magazine that would run on their back cover every month. And I think it's challenging enough to write about politics or birds under deadline, but to try to be funny under deadline is a whole nother world, or at least it was for me. And so that was something I left behind when I left California. Now, you wound up going the opposite direction. So you wrote a book on challenging bird IDs, and then you said, "Hey, there's a niche in the world. How about a beginner's friendly guide?" And you came out with that. Well, now it's 25 years ago, right? 2000. But but
Yeah.
but tell us about that. How did you shift from finding the most difficult bird ID opportunities or issues that we face as birders to saying, "Hey, I gotta help the guys out that are just starting"?
Well, yeah, I'd done the advanced birding thing. I'd written these ID columns. I'd started doing workshops and things, and I frequently found that my workshop was starting off, it was too technical. I'd get partway into it, and somebody would say, that they were lost. They didn't know what I was talking about. And I was looking around. I mean, I was I was 38, and the American Birding Association gave me their Lifetime Achievement Award. And I was like, wait, what? What am I supposed to stop now? But there were, I just had such a sense that there were all these new people coming into birding. But things like, the National Geographic Field Guide was so much more technical than the Peterson or Golden Guides had been. And then Roger Peterson updates his Western Field Guide in 1990. It came out at the same time as my advanced birding. And it was much more, it was still beginner friendly, but it was more technical than his previous books had been. Like he was shifting in that direction. It's the experts who write the reviews of the field guides. And the experts frequently don't care if they're beginner friendly or not. They're just looking to see if that spot is in the right place on that primary feather,
Mhm.
on that Thayer's gull. So I started thinking about what would make a book really, really friendly for newcomers, for beginners. What would make the first step as easy as possible? And that's what led to doing my Kaufman Field Guide series. I illustrated it with photos But Photoshop was just becoming a thing in the mid 90s. So I got it and learned how to use it. You can use a photo and fix it so it actually looks like what the bird would look like in life. I mean, you can take two photos of a gray bird, and depending on the lighting, it will look either reddish brown or blue. So
Uh-huh.
lighting really varies from one photo to another. So I spent, hours, thousands of hours going over editing these photos, taking them out of the backgrounds, putting them together side by side on the color plate. I was working with Rick Bowers and Nora Bowers in Tucson. They this was the late 1990s. It was before digital photos. We had to buy this slide scanner that was about the size of like a small sports car, and cost almost as much. And take the slides out of the slide mounts and scan them on this thing, and then put them back in the slide mounts and mail them back to the photographers. So it was a tedious process that would have been infinitely easier, 5 years later.
Yeah.
But I think the resulting book, it got a good reception from average birders and newcomers.
Which was
Some,
the audience.
sorry, yeah, the audience
That
who
was
was
the audience.
yeah, and some people were like, you did this advanced birding and now you've regressed to the stage of trying to do something for beginners. Like, what's wrong with you? But I felt like, people got a lot of good use out of it, and it's still out there. It's still selling. We did a Spanish language edition of it, which I was really proud of about 5 years later, just to make birding more accessible to a larger audience, and followed up with guides on mammals and on butterflies and on insects, nature of New England, nature of the Midwest. So for a while, I really got to immerse myself in non-bird stuff.
And how was that transition? I mean, was there, were you just attracted I mean, you obviously see those things when you're out birding. Did you just decide you wanted to immerse yourself in that for a little bit?
Well, there'd been a while in my mid-teens when I was really into all aspects of natural history. Once I learned all the birds in my Kansas neighborhood, I got a field guide to butterflies, and then I got a flower guide, and I was really into reptiles and amphibians for a while, just trying to figure those things out. So I had a long-standing interest in butterflies and moths, and so it wasn't that much of a transition. I got to work with real experts. I mentioned Rick and Nora Bowers already. They were co-authors on the Mammal Guide. Jim Brock was the expert behind the Butterfly Guide. Eric Eaton was the brains behind the Insect Field Guide. And in each case, I got to work with these people.
And are the books still out there?
Yeah, the publisher Houghton Mifflin was sold off to HarperCollins, and their Mariner Books division is sort of they're keeping most of them in print. The Mammal Guide has gone out of print. The Spanish language bird guide is out of print, and we're pushing to try to get that re-released. But the others are still out there, still being used.
Okay. Now, tell me about the nature of New England and the nature of the Midwest. And
Okay.
what are those books about?
Well, I sort of wrote those for myself. It's like, if I'm out birding and I see some really interesting looking turtle or something, I'll think, what's that? So these books, they were just focusing on the things that people were likely to see, flowers, the trees, mammals, which, there aren't that many in any given area. The common reptiles and amphibians, some of the common fish, butterflies, the most conspicuous insects, sort of the naked eye, natural history stuff that you're likely to see if you're out. So my wife Kimberly and I co-authored the New England Guide. When we got to the Midwest Guide, my friend Jeff Sayer from Indiana, we've been friends for a long time. He's a great birder, but he's also an amazing botanist. So Jeff Sayer wrote all the material on plants for the Midwest Guide. And it's just really, really educational to get to work on that stuff. And there's so much out there. There's so much fascinating stuff. I mean, I could be fascinated by birds every day of my life, but you look out and I I'm glancing off to the side occasionally. I'm looking out the window. It's the temperature's in the 30s here, and a moth just went fluttering by, and I'll bet it was Ophiroptera bruciata, the bruised spanworm
Well,
moth,
that
because
was
they
my
fly
first
in
guess.
cold weather. I'm sorry.
That was my first guess.
Yeah, right. That's right. But no, they fly in cold weather at the end of fall here. So it's and just, watching the behavior. We've got a skunk living under the brush pile that comes out under some nights, and some nights it doesn't. And, there's so much. If you're interested in nature, you could live 100 lifetimes, 1,000 lifetimes, and never run out of new things to look at.
Yes. Yeah, that is 100% true. One of the dangers of doing this podcast is that almost all of my guests spend a large percentage of the podcast not looking at me or the audience, but looking off to the side because they all have windows in their office and they're all have ADHD and oh my God, a squirrel. And then they're gone and they're trying to pay attention to the podcast, but they're really not. They're watching the moth or the owl or the skunk or whatever it might be. I have to really force myself to not look out over the lake. We had our first common loon of the season
All
on the
right.
lake today,
All
and
right.
that's just when those things start calling, it's just magic. And I wrote a couple of my friends and said, "Oh my God, first ones of the season, you got to come over to the house and they'll come over and we'll sit and it'll look like every other common loon you've ever seen, and yet." Like this is November, so starting next month, we'll start to get gulls coming out to the lake. And we will get sometimes a raft of 5 or 10,000 gulls just a few hundred yards off my dock.
Mhm.
And I could sit and watch them forever.
Mhm.
I could just it's just fantastic. And I have, like you, I've gotten into the megafauna. The book I'm working on now is about 2/3 based on the large mammals,
Cool.
and I'm so enjoying the research and getting out in the field and seeing the animals and doing all that. And there's certainly more than a lifetime of stuff out there to see. You just gotta be willing to get outside, which I think most of our audience does. I think
Mhm.
most of the people that you and I are talking to right now are enthusiastic about getting out there. So let's talk. You've got a couple of more books I wanted to make sure to bring up. Season on the Wind from back in 2019. And just last year, you published The Birds That Audubon Missed. So tell us about those two books.
Okay, yeah. Well, I moved from Arizona to northern Ohio to the edge of Lake Erie, which turns out to be a fabulous spot for spring migration. My wife Kimberly, she was a bird bander with the Black Swan Bird Observatory, and she became the education director, and now she's the executive director there, and they do all this migratory bird research. And when I moved here, I was still working on the insect field guide birds, But there's such an amazing spring migration through here that after a few years, I was just so captivated by it that I felt like I had to try and capture this in prose. So I wrote A Season on the Wind, just sort of follows the progress of spring here from sort of the beginning of February to the burst of, the full peak of spring migration in May. And I try to talk about sort of general aspects of migration at the same time, so it's not just about Ohio. And then the birds that Audubon missed, the title doesn't really describe what it's about, and it's all about sort of discovery or rediscovery of birds, mostly in eastern North America in the early 80s. When obviously the birds here, they were already known to the Native Americans. They had their names. They knew the habits of all these birds, but so these people come over from Europe and try to figure out these birds and describe them within the Linnaean system, give them scientific names and so on. So Alexander Wilson and John James Audubon are like the two main characters in the book, but there were so many things. They had so many adventures. There were so many things about the birds that tripped them up. Or they were confused about warblers and shorebirds and gulls and flycatchers and so on for the same reasons that we are today. And so I just found it fascinating to try and recreate something of that time. And then as a side project, the birds that Wilson and Audubon and others completely overlooked, I tried to paint those in the same style or what I thought would be the same style as Audubon's. It's like, okay, yeah, here's the most famous bird painter in history. I'll just see if I can like emulate his style.
Yeah,
I
that should
didn't
be
succeed.
simple.
I
That should
didn't
be
succeed.
simple. It's like picking up the guitar and saying, "Well, this is how Jeff Beck plays. What's the big
Yeah,
deal?
yeah.
I've got the
Yeah.
same
So
6 strings." So what were some of the birds? What were the birds you're talking about that were maybe missed or difficult for them to identify or differentiate?
well, for example, a Swainson's thrush and great cheek thrush, they're both common migrants through areas where Wilson and Audubon lived, and neither one was described to science until the 1840s, after Wilson was long gone and after Audubon had finished his main work. Yellow-bellied flycatcher and least flycatcher, they missed it at first, but Audubon illustrated those for his second edition in the 80s. Caspian tern, big, noisy, conspicuous. Somehow that was overlooked. They figured it was the same as the royal tern. So just, so really surprising things.
Hmm. And do you have any idea how those things were missed, like the thrushes? What
Yeah, well, in the case of the thrushes, it goes back to a guy named Mark Catesby who did a work on the natural history of the Carolinas. He was a British guy, came over and spent time in the southeastern colonies in the early 1700s. And he wrote about something that he called the brown thrush, which was like a composite of 5 species. And, he's had this sort of wishy-washy illustration of it and a text that sort of described all of them. And so for like a century, people were trying to fit all of the brown thrushes into this category and eventually deciding, well, actually there are 2 species. Well, no, actually there are 3, but somehow the Swainsons and the gray cheek just managed to get lumped in with the others by everyone who was looking at them.
um,
Yeah.
so so I'm curious. I mean, you've been doing this literally for decades, and you seem to be no less enthusiastic. How do you maintain that enthusiasm? I mean, I know you branched out with insects and butterflies and mammals and some different things, but how do you maintain that intense enthusiasm? You and Kimberly are still writing a column, right, for Birds and Blooms, and you're still speaking and you're painting and writing. Where does that come from? Are they just that fascinating to you?
Well, it's just, yeah, it's the birds' fault. They're so amazing that I can't help. I actively look at birds every day. I look at house sparrows and house finches at the feeder. I'll look at them through binoculars like every day, and they're amazing. They're beautiful. I do sketches in my mind and sometimes on paper. And you look at the behavior of these things. You get past the point of being able to identify all of them and look at how their behavior. The house sparrows are ridiculous. There's 20 of them at a time out there at the feeder, and they get spooked by the slightest thing. They all fly off. There's half a dozen house finches out there, and they'll sit and look around and say, well, we don't see any, any problem. They go back to feeding. Just the, differences in behavior like that. Or watched a mourning dove this summer that was sort of wandering around with one wing up and doing this weird thing, and then discovered there was a garter snake on the ground, and it was like reacting to this garter snake. The things they do, even if you don't get out and see a different kind of bird, everything about them is just amazing. A few days ago, I was out birding woods on the edge of Lake Erie and found a red-eyed vireo, which is, an abundant bird here at some times of year, but this was really, really late. And it's like, what is this doing here? In the middle of November, this bird should be in South America. But in that same stretch of woods, I've had other really late birds in the past. A yellow-billed cuckoo a month later than it should have been around. And what's this thing that makes birds go the wrong direction and wind up here? There's so many questions all the time. It doesn't take any effort for me to stay fascinated by birds or insects or plants or mammals, anything.
So it's about if it's outdoors, you're interested in it.
Or indoors. We get some cool bug indoors. I'll photograph it first and then take it outside.
So what's the next project? What are you working on now?
Well, I always feel disoriented if I don't have an actual book in the works. So I'm getting closer and closer to having a contract, I think, for my next book. I've got a really great agent, Wendy Strothman, and now her associate Lauren McLeod. I'm working with them and going back and forth on a book proposal, but it until we actually have a contract, I don't want to get too far into talking about what it's about. But there'll be birds in it.
Really?
Yeah,
Well, I'll tell you what, I I might have been able to figure that one out all on my own, Ken. All right. Well, this is killing me because I still have a stack of questions, but we have been asked to try to keep these to about an hour. So I'm just going to have you come back after the first of the year and we could talk about the other stuff if you're willing.
sure.
Right now, I'm going to throw my email up. If you've got any questions for me, send them to me. It's scott@naturallyscott.com, just in case you're listening and not watching. And I want to ask Ken if you have a book that you might recommend to the audience other than yours. Obviously, we're going to recommend all those and we'll throw the covers up on the YouTube one where people can see them. But what do you have that you think the audience should read or might be interested in?
My number one recommendation would be a book called The Peregrine by J.A. Baker. It was published more than 50 years ago in Britain, but it's some of the most intense and beautiful nature writing that I've ever seen.
Is it specifically about peregrines?
Yeah, it's a guy who sort of dropped out of society and like watched peregrines in his local area, farmland and coast in England, and then wrote this book that's just I read excerpts of it in Audubon magazine back in the 70s. Les Line was the editor of Audubon at that time, and he was fascinated by this book, so he published a few pages of excerpts, and I read that and just got chills. And some of the um, some I can still. I've only read the book through cover to cover 4 or 5 times, but I can still quote like whole paragraphs of just. It's like every word is perfect. It's like there's not it just cuts right to the heart of what it's talking about, and it's beautiful. I haven't ever tried to write that way because I couldn't, but I really recommend it to readers.
Well, if you're watching on YouTube, it's up on the screen and I'll be ordering it. The book that I did that Ken's part of, I asked each of the 52 guests the same 5 questions. Favorite bird, favorite day, nemesis bird, spark bird, and then field guide, which is a separate question. But the top choice, if you took all of the answers that people gave and you combined them, the bird that was mentioned most frequently was a peregrine falcon, either as a spark bird or a favorite bird. So 2 things. I'm actually preparing to give a keynote speech on this book. And so I've been going through the notes and kind of doing the summary and all, and then it brings these things back. But a couple of facts that I think were interesting. Number one, this one about peregrines, which I just learned over the weekend as I was preparing this PowerPoint presentation. And number two, overwhelmingly, raptors were the number one answer to favorite, to nemesis, and to spark bird. But I found this fact equally interesting, and maybe you can comment on this as we wrap up. So I asked, let's exclude the field guide because that doesn't count. So I asked 52 guests 4 questions: favorite bird, favorite day, nemesis bird, and spark bird. So over 210 answers, right? Not one person in one answer mentioned hummingbirds.
That is interesting. You could probably find another group of 52 people where um, where a lot of them would mention hummingbirds as a spark or an inspiration. And I know they're, as you mentioned, we consult. We're the birding experts for Birds and Blooms magazine, which is a backyard publication, and hummingbirds are incredibly popular
Mm-hmm.
with their readership. Now Birds and Blooms has stuff about hummingbirds in multiple issues every year and a whole hummingbird special issue in summer. And it's just, super popular, incredibly popular birds.
Well, and I'm a subscriber and I read the magazine, and again, I'm a relatively new birder. But on trips like down into Arizona or into Panama or Costa Rica, you can go to the hummingbird special, and the people you meet there are they're as enthusiastic about that as others are about, hawk migration and whatnot. And so I just absolutely would have lost that bet that it wouldn't have come up once. Matter of fact, when I did that, then I went through and I said, okay, I'm going to do a word check. And, the book is 90,000, 100,000 words, whatever it is. The word hummingbird does not appear in the book a single time, not a single time, except now
Nope.
I've gone and added it into the introduction to say, hey, if you're reading this for hummingbirds, you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah, wow.
Anyway, you're right.
Well, it's
I could
cool
probably
that the
find
it's cool that the raptors are that. I mean, you're too modest to mention it here, but you've got your raptor book is something worth recommending.
well,
You
that's
ought to
very
take the
kind of you.
opportunity. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's called Raptor Quest, and it was my tiny little big year. Um, and I went and found all 53 of the raptors that call the U.S. home, and they're my favorites by far. But it was just I don't know, it's just fascinating. And for the biggest nemesis bird by far were owls. Um, and these were people like you. These are people that are experts. They've been out there forever, and yet they still haven't found, whatever it might be, a boreal, northern hawk, great gray, clams. So anyway, on that note, Ken, first of all, I want to let you know I will be inviting you back. Absolutely. For those of you that are going to watch the next episode with Ken, we're going to do a parlor trick. That's all I'm going to tell you about. But Ken has an amazing parlor trick that I want to share with you. That maybe we'll just make a whole episode about this parlor trick. But that being the case, Ken, this has been so fun for me, and I love the conversations we've had. I thoroughly enjoyed this. I know the audience will. So thank you very much and sincerely for taking the time. And for all of you that are out there, as I wrap up every show the same way, get outside as often as you can. Or if you can, poke around the house, find a couple of insects, take some pictures, do some ID, and then free the little booger. But when you are outside, or I guess if you can, when you're inside, make sure you stay safe and stay curious. Ken, thank you very much, my friend. I enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you so much, Scott.